All right, welcome everybody to our third episode of Paleo Talks here on our Friday noon sessions. This week we have a special guest, Dr. Stephen Wallace is going to talk to us about red pandas, living and fossil. I should note it's AKA Wally, that's what we all call him, and we'll get to meet him here in just a moment. Before we get started, I do want to introduce David Moscato, the co-host, and he will briefly go over how the format works. David?
Sure thing. So I'm David. I'm one of the paleontologists at the Gray Fossil site and science communicator for the site. And today I'm going to be moderating and helping out. So we're going to start with Blaine's going to lead Wally through a handful of questions, get Wally to talk about red pandas and his own research. And then about halfway through, so 15, 20 minutes in, we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. So when that happens, everyone can go ahead and type their questions. If you scroll to the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A option. And if you type a question in there, we'll be able to see it. I'll read out as many as we can get through and pass them over to Wally to answer.
All right, thank you, David. So I'm Blaine Schubert. I'm the director of the Center of Excellence in Paleontology, and this is just a way for us to continue reaching out to our students and to the public about paleontology that we do and that some of our colleagues are doing as well. So hopefully, looks like we have about 38 people all together right now, and that group will continue to grow. So hopefully you all enjoy this. Again, we're going to be talking today with Dr. Stephen Wallace from his mountain home out in the wilderness down here in the Appalachians. And Wally, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and tell us just a little bit about your research overall, and then we'll move into talking about red pandas. Thanks.
Well, I'm Steve Wallace. I'm a professor in geosciences, curator out at the museum, and also director of site excavations out at the Gray Fossil site. And really, my sort of specialty is sort of small carnivorans. But like a lot of us, I've dabbled in a lot of other animals, everything from tapirs and rhinos to, occasionally big cats and things like that. But red pandas are sort of my, favorite, and I take every opportunity to come back to them.
Great. So, yeah, I've known Wally for a long time. I was the second paleontologist to come to the site after he invited me out from Arkansas. And actually, one of the stories that I have is his picture that he sent me of the red panda when it was first discovered, and he asked me what I thought it was, and I said, well, it looks like a raccoon with some extra cusps. And he said, yeah, I already knew that. And then I think he went on to talk to some other colleagues. So Wally, maybe tell us a little bit about sort of the evolution of red pandas.
Sure.
And how that moves forward, and start sharing some slides.
Sure, I can do that. And really, what's kind of fun with just red pandas in general is they're just, they're adorable little critters. I mean, everybody loves these guys when they see them. And, the question I often get is that this thing looks like a raccoon. People, instantly want to say it's a raccoon or something like that. And of course, it's not a simple answer. It's more complicated. If I wanted to show some little trees of these guys, really the thing to notice here is, again, don't worry about the details. Just notice that, red pandas sort of cluster with things like weasels and skunks and raccoons. And in fact, I kind of like this illustration because in a sense, it reminds you that, there are a lot of different types of carnivorans out there. And really, the important thing is to notice that raccoons are right next to red pandas. I mean, they all sort of fit together here, but at the same time, how they relate to weasels, how they relate to skunks, bounces around a little bit. So the take-home message I always tell people is, if you think they look like a raccoon, you think they look like a weasel, you think they look like a skunk, you're right. They all kind of lump together, and they all share a lot of characteristics. And so they're kind of a fun group to study. They're ornery little carnivorans. And like I said, I just love working on them. The downside is when it comes to their evolution, we were stuck sort of dealing with genetics primarily to figure out how they're related to other animals, because the fossil record itself is mostly just fragmentary jaws and teeth and, little scraps. There's not a lot of fantastic specimens out there. when you go to other parts of the world, which I'll show you in a map here in a second, they are found throughout the northern hemisphere as fossils, but they're usually just isolated specimens. And in fact, if you remember our trip to China many years ago, we got these pictures of some Pleistocene red pandas from caves. But again, they're just often isolated teeth, and so there's just not a lot to work with.
Hey, David, are you seeing the teeth blown up there, or are you seeing Wally?
I see the teeth with Wally on the side.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect. That's just my setting then.
Yeah, when you're looking at these things through Zoom, there's a center column that you can sort of scroll over or push over if you want to make the pictures bigger. But they're to me, these are beautiful teeth. Any paleontologist would say, oh, those are fantastic teeth. But to the average person, you'd put all of these in the palm of your hand and they're little scraps. And there's just only, even though I think they're beautiful, there's just only so much information I can get from them.
Right.
But,
right.
There are exceptions. Really, actually, I should probably show you this real fast. If you can see my little mouse scrolling along here again, this is just the main take-home message from this is notice that there are dots in North America, dots throughout Europe, and then some dots in Asia. And then the green is just sort of the modern distribution. So at one time, they were spread all over the Northern Hemisphere. They're just restricted to those green zones now. So the dots are the fossils, the little shaded patches are where they are now. So, they have been widespread in the past. We do get the occasional good specimen, but for the most part, they're just fragmentary. Now, the reason I say occasional good specimen is that I have to mention at least one particular group or one particular genus, Simoscion, which has been discovered at a variety of localities in New World and Old World. But in particular, there's some sites in Spain, Cerro de Bationes, where they find fairly articulated skeletons. And this top illustration is one of these articulated skeletons. Here's a couple of jaws from one of those localities. And because of these, they can say a lot about the animal. And one of the neat things that we see is very early on in their evolution, they were moving into the trees. And in fact, what's interesting is when you see this illustration, you probably look at it and say, wow, it kind of looks, like a goofy colored mountain lion. Well, they're actually big. They really are that large. The fossil ones are the size of a mountain lion. Simoscion is the size of a mountain lion, but they were moving into the trees.
So Wally, when I look at that picture you put up there, it looks like it has quite the M1 carnassial.
Yes, actually, that's a good question. What's really neat about these early forms is they appear to be almost, they've been interpreted as being almost hyper carnivorous. So in a sense, they were meat eaters. And when you look at these early pandas, they clearly were eating a high percentage of meat, but notice that they have a big second molar, so they were also able to eat at least some vegetation. And what happens in the lineage is that M1 becomes shortened, becomes sort of expanded, the talonid basin gets bigger, and so they go from eating mostly meat to eating mostly vegetation, and it's probably directly related to this shift up into the trees. And what's neat is because they have skeletons of Simoscion in Spain, they've actually been able to describe the little, quote, panda's thumb. Even these early ones have that, quote, panda's thumb, and they've interpreted it as a climbing adaptation. So you can envision these guys as, climbing up into the trees, sort of like with their kill, sort of like a leopard, dragging up into the trees. And the natural question is always, well, why would you go up into the trees if you're preying on other mammals and whatnot? And the reality of it is they were coexisting with some pretty big cats. This is Carrodus giganteus. It's something that is not this exact species, but a related species is found even at those same sites. But this was a common animal at that time. So in reality, what you're looking at is just like a leopard today. They're dragging their kill up into the trees to avoid these larger carnivorans. And it probably, if you think about it, evolution's one of those funny things. It just works with what it has. But when you get new innovations, these abilities to climb around in the trees, well, the selective pressures change and you go from being a hyper carnivore eating mostly meat to a hypo carnivore eating mostly vegetation. And that seems like what this lineage did.
So you think that the red panda, if we went, the ones that we see today and the ones at the Gray fossil site, that their ancestor would have looked more like Simoscion?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, one of the things I should have highlighted is those teeth that I showed you earlier are actually pretty big.
Mm.
When you look at the fossil teeth that are found throughout Europe, they're pretty sizable. And even the red panda that we have at Gray is quite a bit larger than the living red panda. So the lineage itself started pretty big. We're just stuck with these tiny, remnants. And so we have
Mm.
this misconception that, well, red pandas are tiny. Well, most fossil red pandas are big. It's just the ones that are alive today that are small. So they
Okay.
probably would have looked a lot like Simocyan. And when I talk about some of Mauricio's illustrations, I'll show you his current illustration of our red panda, and it looks a lot like that. It's very long and lanky and much more like a mountain lion shape.
Great. If we could move into looking at the GFS panda and some of its
Sure.
features.
Sure. One of the things that, that picture there should look familiar. One of the things that struck me, when we first discovered these fossils, and in fact, I should highlight that tooth up there. That's probably the
Hmm.
picture. I mean,
It
that is probably
is.
the picture I sent
It
you.
is.
Um, was found by Larry Bristol. He was out walking his dog on the fossil site, and he found this odd tooth. And it took some hunting around to figure out what this thing was, because I had the same thought you had. It looks like a raccoon, but it's weird. It's got some extra cusps on it. And Xiaoming Wang was the first to say, that's got an inflated metacondyl. That looks like it's, a quote, red panda. And that kind of started us down that line. But originally, we just had those fragment, just a few teeth. I mean, I hate to say fragmentary because they're beautiful teeth, but it wasn't a skeleton.
Hmm.
But slowly but surely, we accumulated new specimens, a lower jaw. I can remember Brian actually calling me. I was on campus and he said, "We have this jaw that kind of looks like a raccoon." And I was like, "Well, is it a raccoon or is it, a panda?" And he's like, "I don't know." But I said, if you think it's a raccoon, it's probably our panda. And of course, today we've got these beautiful, fairly complete skeletons. We actually have two really nice skeletons. One that's about 98% complete, that looks like it's our female, and then a male that looks like it's about 75% complete. This is the female skull when she was finished, just because she's really gorgeous. But one of the things that the teeth started telling us right away, and the skull started telling us right away, is sort of that when you look at fossil red pandas and try to put them into some sort of a tree, a phylogeny, that there really are sort of two main lineages. There's sort of this basal lineage that focuses on modifying its molars and keeping its premolars basically used for eating, meat, things like that. Just modifying the molars with some extra cusps. And then you have a whole nother group that includes the living red panda that modify all their teeth. And our little guy falls in that first group, where it still has a functional carnassial, it still has premolars that are blade-like, decent sized canines. It sort of still falls in that, and it's pretty basal within that. I mean, it's not as advanced as some of the European forms. So, the gray fossil specimen, the gray fossil site specimen, is really neat, or species, I should say, is really neat in the sense that it gives us kind of a window of what early pandas would have looked like, but we're still missing kind of this the lineage that gives rise to the living panda. I'd love to find some more basal members of that one. When you look at this tree, I feel like there's some branches here that are missing, but
Hmm.
I'm like every paleontologist, though I always want more. That's
So,
just how it
so,
works.
so tell us a little bit more about the living ones. How many different species are there?
Well, let me finish one last thing here real quick
Yep, sure.
before I leave these guys. I do at least want to mention one cool thing that we have noticed with our fossil ones too, is that they're actually sexually dimorphic. When you look at living red pandas, they're not. Their males and females are basically the same size. There's really no difference in their morphology. Their teeth are basically the same. But in our fossil ones, we had a gracile, slender one and a large, massive one. And so we were able to recognize that these things are indeed sexually dimorphic. And so this little illustration here just literally shows the pink one is our female, which is about 98% complete and about twice the size of a living red panda, and the blue one is our male, who's about 3 times the size. So I at least wanted to kind of mention that as kind of a a neat little
Mhm.
prelude, if you want to say, or a little side note, is that they are pretty sexudomorphic.
Right.
But as far as the living ones, when they look at the genetic work lately, they've decided that they want to split the living ones into two species. I've talked to a few zookeepers. When I say zookeepers, the head of the species survival plan is actually at the Knoxville Zoo, and I've talked to her about it quite a bit. Or not quite a bit, but just a little bit recently, since this new paper came out splitting the living red panda into two species. And we're both kind of wondering whether this is really a genuine thing or whether it's a conservation thing,
Mhm.
because there have always been two subspecies of living red panda. There's Ailurus fulgens, and then there's Ailurus fulgens styani. And styani is just a little bit bigger and a little bit darker. And they do have slightly different distributions. Styani is more of the Chinese form. Fulgens is more of the more east into places like Nepal and India. And really the whether or not they're different, they genetically clearly they're a little different. They are subspecies, but whether they're truly deserve to be separate species, that's a weird question. And I think what's happening again is that it's a conservation thing. If you call them
Mhm.
different species, now you can say they're even more critically endangered, and you can
Right.
pour more money into it.
Right. Right. All right. Well, I know we've gotten some really incredible, relatively complete skeletons from the fossil side of these red pandas. So, with these, what kind of research are you guys moving forward with?
There's all kinds of fun stuff that we've started doing. I mean, I feel like I could spend,
Mhm.
6 hours talking about the different things we're going to do with the limbs, the different things we're going to do with the feet, the different things we're going to do with the actual axial skeleton. But some of the fun early things that we've done, we've had students that have come along
Mhm.
and done some early reconstructions showing you our fossil red panda. Remember, this is Erin Woodruff's
Yep.
reconstruction next to a living red panda. Um, I still continue to go to
Mhm.
the zoos constantly to not only photograph pandas, but work with the keepers, look at behaviors. We've been doing a lot of behavioral work recently, trying to look at how they're using their forelimbs. Are they right-handed, left-handed, things like that. Uh, Sounds obvious,
Mhm.
when you think about primates, but it's not something that you think about with red pandas. But because they have that opposable thumb, they do tend to grasp things like a person would or a primate would, and they do tend to favor one hand or the other. So we're
Mhm.
having some fun, playing around documenting that. We of course have also done, we're working on the skulls, working on the teeth. We've done some wonderful uh, three-dimensional CT scans, which have created some,
Mhm.
really neat
Mhm.
digital um, digital opportunities, because you don't realize until you start scanning these things and putting them together in the computer, you start recognizing differences that aren't as readily obvious when you're just looking at measurements, when you're just looking at
Mhm.
the fossils one at a time. For sake of argument, here you have a right and left manus of the male, and then this is just part of the female over here. But the right and left manus of the male, first glance, they're different sizes.
Mhm.
And so this is why we've started looking into this handedness thing, is do these sizes perhaps reflect handedness in our fossil? And you think, oh, it's easy, we'll just figure out how do people recognize it in the living ones. Well, then we realize no one's documented that, so we're having to start from scratch with the living. But
Mhm.
these digital scans have been a lot of fun. Some of the reconstructions are a riot. This one looks like somebody squeezed him really hard, or maybe he's got an atomic fart coming out the back. I don't know. But this was when they first started, reconstructing the digital skeleton. The later reconstructions were gorgeous,
Yeah.
and being able to pose these in different ways and look at them. But again, this was a composite skeleton put together for a display, and so it was really neat. It's really beautiful, but it's not quite as accurate.
Mhm.
Mauricio, while he's been here, of course, he's doing it bone by bone, and only looking at, for sake of argument, this skeleton is our male, and so it's showing you just how complete our male skeleton is. And the colored ones are things that he added in just to be able to sort of flesh it out.
Right.
But I look at the morphology, I look at the different things that I can interpret from these three-dimensional skeletons. Well, he takes it a whole nother direction. Mauricio, of course, is doing these wonderful sketches And, he can do it the traditional way with actual sketches, or he can print out, his skeleton that he has articulated with the real bones and then sketch on top of that. And he's actually created some beautiful reconstructions. And I think this comes back to one of your earlier questions of how would the fossil ones have looked. When you look at that animal there, it really doesn't look anything like a living red panda. It does look more like to me, it reminds me of a puma or something like that, because the head is normal size, the body is fairly lanky and muscular. Living red pandas have a giant head. I mean, they're all head because of all the musculature and the dentition associated with chewing and chewing and chewing and chewing. They're basically little cows. So they have a giant head. Well, ours was still somewhat carnivorous, and so it has basically a normal sized head and teeth, to go with.
Yeah, if I wasn't seeing that face, I would think of a Wolverine or something like that.
Yeah, size wise, ours is definitely, basically, our male is the size of a Wolverine, but he does have somewhat lanky arms. So I feel like, in some respects, you're taking if you go back and look at the previous one, it's almost like you're taking a Wolverine and stretching it out a little bit. I don't know how painful that would be, but it's entertaining to think about. But
all right, well, it's time for us to open it up to questions from the audience. And everybody,
sure.
We've done it a little bit differently than in previous weeks. We're doing webinar mode this week, so you need to actually go into the question and answer panel if you have questions. And David will ask those questions. David, do we have any?
Yeah, we do. So as a reminder for everybody, if you move your cursor down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little tab that says Q&A. And if you click on that, you can type in a question and we'll see it and we'll be able to read it out to answer it. So our first question, we'll see, as the questions come in, we'll see how many of these we can get through. This one's a nice straightforward one. Are red pandas fossils found worldwide?
They're found throughout the northern hemisphere, but not the southern hemisphere. So they have been found in Europe. They have been found in Asia. There's a specimen from Japan that I think is probably an otter rather than a red panda, but there have been some found in Russia. So when you think about North America, Europe, and then of course throughout Asia, that's pretty much the northern hemisphere. But there's nothing that's been found south of the equator. It'd be really cool, but so far it hasn't turned up. Actually, I'm going to take one step back. I'm thinking mostly of what I would call a red panda, which is, basically the lurines, these little guys like this. If you go back far enough, there are some animals that people include into the Ailuridae, sort of the broader group. I think there are some relatives of Simoscion that have been found in parts of Africa and places like that, but they're not really what I would call red panda. Sorry, that's the technical answer. I didn't mean to do that.
So while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I'll ask a question, and that is, how do you imagine our gray-site red panda fitting into the ecosystem around? Like, we have tons of animals and plants that we know of from the fossil site. Where would it sort of fit?
I think in reality, I like to think of it as sort of a raccoon ecomorph, in the sense that it's an omnivore. It's eating plants and animals. Its teeth definitely suggest that it could still eat meat. It has functional carnassials on its upper carnassials are still carnassial blade. Its lower carnassial, though, is being modified for eating more vegetation. So I think it was probably this kind of in-between animal in terms of what it could eat. However, it's big. This is an animal that's the size of a Wolverine and a little lanky. So to me, I kind of envision it as this, you think of it kind of like a Wolverine that eats whatever it wants. It's fairly large. It's not going to be intimidated by most carnivores that are running around, but should a big cat, especially a big saber-toothed cat or something like that come along, it can scurry up into the trees and hang out up there if it needs to.
Okay, here's another question from Mariah, who says, is the male red panda always bigger?
That's a good question. In Like I said, in living red pandas, they're not sexually at least in terms of size. In the study that Ethan and I did a few years back, we did actually recognize that in the living red panda, the canines are a little bit bigger in the males than they are in the females. But that's the only thing we could find in the living red panda. As far as the fossils, the actual answer is probably no. What we're seeing at Gray is that we seem to see kind of two morphs. There's a smaller, more gracile morph, and then there's a larger, more robust morph. And we're interpreting the larger one as the male, the smaller one as the female. However, we haven't found a baculum to say for sure that the big one is the male, but in reality, what we're seeing is if you plot all these out, there's a nice even distribution in both categories. And so some of the really large females, even though they're more gracile, probably would have been larger than some of the smaller males. But we can tell by a robustness that there are two groups. It's just we have found some. In fact, this last year, we were finding some bones that appeared to be in the gracile group, but they were long. So it was probably a fairly tall female that it was probably, as big, if not bigger than some of the smaller males. But average-wise, if you did an average, yes, the average male is bigger than the average female.
And here's a related question from Sarah, who asks, is there an advantage for a species to lose its sexual dimorphism through evolution?
That's a really good question. I'm not really sure how to answer that one. Normally, when you see sexual dimorphism, it has to do with social behaviors and the types of social behaviors that the animal exhibits. And so it's usually not a simple answer. It's usually somewhat complicated. In a lot of animals that are sexually dimorphic today, particularly carnivorans, usually it's the males fighting with each other over females. Perhaps a male is, protecting or, has a group of females that it interacts with. And of course, the bigger that it can be, the larger territory it can defend and have more females encased within it. When you look at living red pandas, because they're completely up in the trees now, they have different types of social interactions, and the males and females do tend to do more of a pair bond thing. And so there's not really the advantage for the male being any larger. And so it becomes an energy disadvantage to become big. So in reality, it's easier for them just to be the same size as the females. They tend to have these sort of, in a sense, pair bonds and stick together. I know this sounds ridiculously cuddly, but the males and females are really affectionate, during the breeding season. So it's probably related to that. But again, because it's a change in the social structure, that's often difficult to interpret in the fossil record.
Here's another question about red panda evolution. This is from Dave, our grad student Dave, who says, "Hey, Wally, you mentioned the evolutionary history of red pandas trending from hypercarnivorous to more omnivorous, with raccoons being closely related to the pandas. Do you know if their evolutionary history was similar? Do they show a similar shift from carnivory to omnivory?"
From what I can recollect, it is very similar. And in fact, I think that, to me, I almost view them as kind of a neat parallel. I think there's a reason why they look so similar today, because they did kind of have a similar evolutionary history. When you look at some of the fossil procyonids that are older, that are big, they often are more carnivorous than the more modern ones. I don't mean more modern as in more advanced, just, the ones that are still here today. However, I'm not as familiar with the procyanid record as I am with the aelurid. So I'm not going to say that with any, don't quote me on that. I'll be honest.
Sure. We've had a couple of people, Brenna and Janice, have asked, how many individuals do we have of pandas at the Gray site?
I think last time I checked, I think our MNI was 8, which is pretty high. I mean, when you think about mammals at Gray, if we do the MNI is the minimum number of individuals for people that don't know, so you're always looking for duplicating elements. And most of our mammals are in the single digits. Most of our critters in general, the only time you get big numbers is when you talk about turtles or tapirs. But most of our mammals are in the single digits. And so I think the red panda is probably in, like 3rd or 4th place.
Okay, and how does that, as a follow-up, how does that compare to other fossil sites with pandas?
Pandas are usually pretty rare. The only sites that I'm familiar with that actually have a fair number um, are in Europe. There's a couple sites in Germany that have a lot of teeth, but unfortunately, because they're mostly teeth, their MNIs are still really low because the odds of you getting, you know, 8 left M1s or something like upper M1s are pretty small. So most of those sites, the MNI is usually only 1 or 2 individuals at most. And to actually backtrack to one of the previous questions, there's a site in Germany where 2 different species of panda have actually been named from the same site. And most authors, including myself, feel that they're probably just males and females because the only difference morphologically between those 2 species is size. And it's literally, they're all teeth. They just have, 2 size sets of teeth that basically look the same. There's just some that are big and some that are a little smaller. And, there was an author that split them, but I suspect there's probably males and females. It seems more logical.
I think we'll get ready to start wrapping it up here, Wally, but I have one more question that's sort of a combination question that I'm seeing coming up, and that is, how long do you think they lasted here in North America? Any chance they overlapped with people?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I really wish they had. I think it would have been pretty neat to have seen these guys. I think, unfortunately, what probably happened is with the connection of the Isthmus of Panama, one of the new critters to come up were actually true raccoons, the genus Procyon. And I suspect what probably happened is as they came up and moved into North America, they filled or occupied a very similar niche as red pandas. I mean, I suspect they may have pushed them out. I mean, I can't, that's a hard one to prove or disprove, but it does seem to be very coincidental time-wise that red pandas are only found latest Miocene, earliest Pliocene in North America, and then they're gone. And so it seems like something either outcompeted them, or it's also possible that they were simply the remnants of an environment that no longer exists. In fact, the latter is probably just as likely because we know that Gray was kind of this holdover site where the forest was staying while grasslands were spreading everywhere else, and pandas were part of a once more widespread northern forest, a northern temperate forest that's gone now. And when you look at the remnants of plants that are found in eastern United States that are related to plants in East Asia, those are remnants of that same relic forest or that same earlier forest. So it's possible that whatever reason they hung on in Asia, red pandas that is, but they did not hang on here.
So maybe we can blame South America.
We can do that. We can blame South America if we want. Those pesky raccoons coming up, and I mean, it was, how it is. It's nature. It's probably both. It was probably the changing environment, the loss of that habitat, and then the introduction of a new competitor was probably just too much.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer that original question, I think it's unlikely that they ever around at the same time as people. I think they were gone. I think the Gray Fossil Site and the site in Washington are probably the last representatives in North America.
I'm not sure how much we talked about the other specimen that's here in North America. Maybe mention that again.
Yeah, I did sort of gloss over that by accident. I'll just stated it's in Washington State. It's a single tooth from the Ringgold Formation. Most of the material there is Blancan. You look at Gray, we're probably latest Tempilian, earliest Blancan. So their site's probably just a touch younger. But what's interesting about that single tooth is that it seems to be a very advanced panda relative to ours. Mm-hmm. So even though they're very similar in age, they seem to be in very different positions on the tree. So it's probably 2 separate immigration events from Asia. But unfortunately, that's all that's ever been found is that single tooth. If you remember, Blaine, when we went to Los Angeles to hunt for more, I remember finding some bear teeth, and you got excited. But
but we didn't find any more.
Find any more panda because they had a lot of for those listening, they had a lot of uncatalogued material from the same locality there in Los Angeles. And so we were just sort of rummaging through all the bits and pieces, hoping to find some isolated teeth. And Blaine got lots of bears, but.
Yeah, you did. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Wally. We're running out of time.
That's normal.
And so thank you so much. That was
Sure.
really informative and interesting. What we're going to do is we're going to shut it down. I'm going to turn off the recording here in just a minute, but people can stick around and ask a few more questions. I do want to let everybody know that we have our plan for next week for the show, and that will be Rachel Short talking about rhinos, which actually is something that Wally worked on with her. He was her advisor. So join us next week for that. If you have questions that have gone unanswered, we will also work on getting those answered either through our Facebook site, or if you want to stick around for a little bit after the recording stops. So again, thank you, Wally.
Sure, no problem. Do you want me to stop sharing or leave it on for now?
You can leave it on. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.